All right. We're talking war, as Matt Wilkins would call it. KOTOR Volume 10 War. The last story in this omnibus. As I believe. I believe that is so. I mean, technically, we have a guide that's the very end, but I'll just say the guide's pretty nice. It came out mid the KOTOR original KOTOR comic run. So, as I said before, KOTOR Demon is technically the end of the Knights of the Old Republic series. Ends with issue 50, which came out February of 2010. By this point, John Jackson Miller had moved on to Knight Errant, which is Kara Holt's story, which is Old Republic, but it's much later. Closer to Darth Bane trilogy than this era. It was okay. But we should talk about John Jackson Miller's ideology that comes through on this. And it's not a bad thing. Normally when I talk ideologies, I talk a lot about politics and stuff. But every author has their own ideology that comes out in their writing. The only exceptions I can think of are really James Luceno and Matthew Stover. James Luceno is solely focused on continuity, and it's almost like a historical text at times when he does his continuity. I love it. Matthew Stover does something different every time he writes. He's that good. For instance, Shatterpoint's a war book, whereas, like, Luke Skywalker in the Shadows of Mindor at times is a hard sci-fi book / like an opera, like a space opera thing. Like, it's a retelling to a media outlet. It's bizarre. And each one of his books is different. I mean, Revenge of the Sith is like almost Shakespearean. Right? But, like, most authors have their own ideology. We'll take Karen Traviss, for instance. Karen Travis's clone books, and to an extent, pretty much all of her books, are that, like, the clones, the Mandalorians, are sort of slaves. Especially the clones. They're slaves to the Republic. The Mandalorians are downtrodden. Like, that's sort of the overarching thing with her stuff. John Jackson Miller's thing has been the protagonist is there to help the little people. With the exception of course, Lost Tribe of the Sith, where everyone's a villain in that. They're all Sith. Kara Holt is probably the prime example of this, where Kara Holt, it doesn't matter that she's a Jedi. Like, she doesn't care what the Jedi have to say. She's going to help people no matter what. I mean, that the last arc of Knight Errant, she's undercover with the Sith, trying to help people trapped behind enemy lines. Like, that's sort of the ideology. In Kenobi, Obi-Wan comes out of seclusion to help a small farming community, basically. And of course, Zane Carrick, he just wants to help everyone. So when we get to KOTOR is referred to as by John Jackson Miller as 3 different big storylines. The first was Fugitive, which is the first 6 volumes when they were originally collected. The second arc is called Freelancer, and that's volumes 7 through 9. What would be the third storyline only was this volume, and it is Foot Soldier. So KOTOR Volume 10 War takes place 1 year after the last storyline. When Zane was traveling home, he got picked up by the Republic and drafted into their military to fight the Mandalorians. And Zane is on his own with the Republic. He is a grunt. They let him keep his lightsaber, but he disobeys orders, and it leads to him and his squadron getting captured by the Mandalorians, because the Jedi he's working with have defected to the Mandalorians. So we actually get the Mandalorian perspective of this war, which is something that really isn't brought up a lot. It's Mandalorian family dynamics, which is interesting, where they're nomadic people and they have children, and it gets into that. And our antagonist isn't necessarily a villain, which I really liked. He he is the Jedi Master that left the Jedi Council, and that's why Lucian Dre ended up on the Council near the end of the Fugitive storyline. So it makes sense why he's here. He's decided that he's going to teach the Mandalorians the Force, because Mandalore is kind of obsessed with the Force still, which is interesting. And he's just seen the atrocities that the Republic is doing to the Mandalorians, and war's hell sort of thing is something that's been there, done that with Star Wars at this point. But here is the ultimate problem with KOTOR War. It's only 1/3 of the KOTOR cast. So this is a prime example of why a Zane story doesn't work without Griff or Jariel. Granted, they do show up, they have cameos. But the three of them together is what made this series so special, and their dynamics with one another. In fact, Jariel shows up at the very end, and it's just a cameo. There is no purpose to it, other than to say, "Hey, we're still together. We're still dating." Griff helps with some intel in the middle of the storyline, just to show that he's still, even though he's legit now, he still has the underworld connections. But it's just bizarre. It's really, really bizarre. It almost. I remember when Matt Wilkins reviewed this, he said that it's a much older Zane. It's not. It's not really. He's only a year older than he was at the end of the main series, but he feels older. He feels a little more jaded. He's still the good character that I really, really liked. Like, he's still Zane, but it's Zane on his own, and it doesn't quite work. And I think if it had, we would have gotten more Knights of the Old Republic stories following this. Because this was the thing back in the 2010s with Dark Horse. So I think they realized they screwed up when they ended all their main series, which would have been, I mean, Rebellion was going nowhere. It ended with Vector, so that was long gone by this point. But we had Dark Times went off and did several mini-series after this, rather than continue with its original numbering, which, granted, it was a renumbering of Star Wars Republic, which was a retitling of Star Wars Volume 2. So that was weird in and of itself, but it's the only one that really continued. Knights of the Old Republic and Legacy ended. They ended, and especially in Legacy's case, it was not a good ending. So I think they wanted them to end at 50. Like, there was some weird obsession with ending these series at issues 50. Whether they should or shouldn't have. Thankfully, KOTOR, although it feels a tad rushed compared to the first storyline, it's good enough that it didn't feel so bad. Legacy didn't fare as well, in my opinion. So they got these 5-issue miniseries called War. And KOTOR was my first experience with War. And boy, I was not thrilled with this. I did not like this for a long time. It soured the series for me. because it's not even completely different. It's just different enough that it's not what I wanted. Um, Legacies, although it does some really dumb stuff, which I'll get to when I review Legacy, does some really stupid things in the beginning, it ends better than this. This, I think John Jackson Miller was told, if this sold well, we will make more of them, because it's open ended. It's a whole new storyline for Zane that is opened up. It's a storyline I don't care for. I won't spoil it, but like, it's not necessary, and it doesn't really fit what Zane was like at the end of Demon. At the end of Demon, he has this whole network of in the Republic where they can rescue people and help the little people while the Jedi go and fight the Mandalorians. I liked that more than what is set up here. Um, yeah, it's like almost like John Jackson Miller wrote Knight Errant for too long, and he didn't get out of the Knight Errant mindset when writing War, because War feels more like a Knight Errant comic than it does a Knights of the Old Republic comic. And Knight Errant, aside from the protagonist is kind of bland, they're fine stories, and Zane Carrick would fit in there perfectly if he had Griff and Jariel and they were involved. And I sometimes wonder, with the end of this, I think he would have incorporated Griff and Jariel and probably even brought back Camper. Because Camper's story was never, it doesn't have a satisfying ending. Like, if he had gone, say, another 50 issues, I think Camper would have come back. And we would have gotten more conclusion with that. Heck, it's weird to think about, like, the what ifs, because I can honestly say Dark Horse editorial would have gotten heavily involved in this if this had sold well. And they would have done stupid things. Their track record at this time is ghastly, and that's the nicest way of putting it. For every Legacy 2, because yes, Legacy got a sequel, which is fine. It's probably the best thing that was going in the 2010s, right before the buyout happened. You have your Brian Wood Star Wars, which is virtually a reboot, although Randy Stradley says it's not. Everyone else said it was. And no one liked that. You had Invasion, which was finally Randy Stradley got what he wanted, and he did his own TCW version of New Jedi Order. And it's awful. You had things like Rebel Heist, that 4-issue miniseries. It's like a heist that's like to reset up what's going to happen in episodes 5 and 6, but it doesn't do it well. You had your Darth Maul miniseries that were just canceled TCW episodes, which are fine. Knight Errant, Jedi the Dark Side, which I will be getting to very soon. Because that is a whole bizarre thing. Just like Darth Vader miniseries, everything was a miniseries, with the exception of Brian Wood's Star Wars and Legacy 2. And the miniseries idea, I know I'm getting into the weeds here with this review, but it is very crucial for what unfortunately befell Knights of the Old Republic. A little comic called Hellboy was broken up into miniseries. So you could always have an issue 1 after a few issues. You have issue 1 of this many, you open it up, oh, it's actually issue 50 of this. It worked for Knights, it worked for Hellboy. That doesn't work for everyone. But unfortunately, Dark Horse got obsessed with this, and it's kind of ruined a lot of their IPs. For instance, the Predator IP kept becoming Hunters miniseries. You had Hunters, which is fine, but then you had Hunters 2 and Hunters 3. Or Aliens was always a 4-issue miniseries and like of various quality, with the exception of course, they allowed Brian Wood to do whatever he wanted. I sometimes wonder if Brian Wood is really cheap to hire, and that's why Dark Horse kept him around so long, because quite honestly, his stuff is so bad. I mean, I have heard from critics that his Conan Queen of the Black Coast is good, but I've also heard that all of his other Conan stuff is garbage. So I don't understand, other than a financial, like a fiscal reason, why you would hire him. Or he maybe, like in the case of what we know about Troy Denning, where Troy Denning kept getting work because he wrote quickly, and that's why Super Stony rehired him to do all the post Jedi books, basically, starting with like Dark Nest and all that. Like he just wrote fast, and they could just release things. Doesn't mean it's quality. In fact, it really isn't. But that might be why the Brian Wood thing stayed for, oh my gosh, almost 10 years. He had like a tenure at Dark Horse. It started with Conan, went into Star Wars a little bit, and then Aliens. Stayed in Aliens forever, and ooh, it was not good. At some point, we will get to Defiance. I've talked about Defiance before. I remember, if you stayed with the channel a really long time, you remember when Defiance was coming out and how bad it was. And it just never ended. And then there was like Resistance, and then I think there's a third one, but I've never read the third one. I never finished Resistance because it was so bad. Um, but yeah, just weird, weird. But Knights of the Old Republic War specifically is fine. I think that the Vector story is worse than War. But War is just not a good Knights of the Old Republic story. As a Star Wars story set in the Old Republic, I say it's fine. It does what it's supposed to do. You get your Mandalorian fix, you get your Jedi fix. There's no Revan, there's no Malak, which is good. If they had continued Knights of the Old Republic, I could almost guarantee we would have had Zane fight Darth Revan. It would have been stupid. It would have been awful. And it would have been an editorial choice and not a John Jackson Miller choice. Because Dark Horse really, at this point, forgot what made Star Wars good. It's true. They forgot what made a good Star Wars story. It's a shame because, in my opinion, up until this point, they were like the last bastion of quality with the Star Wars IP. Del Rey started falling off a little bit after Revenge of the Sith came out. You have your Dark Nest, which is bad. You have Legacy of the Force, which has one great author, an okay author, and Karen Traviss. And then we have Fate of the Jedi after that, which thankfully Karen Traviss had left, so her ego went away. And you got Christie Golden, which I really wish, in hindsight, Christie Golden would have gotten some other Star Wars novels, like at least one of her own, before being thrust into this project, because that's crazy. And that was solely like I mean, I'm glad they didn't put Karen Miller in there. That would have been horrific. But yeah, Legacy of the Force and Fate of the Jedi are beasts for another time to deal with. But as it stands, I think KOTOR War is a solid 3.8 out of 5. It's worth your time, but I think of people like my friend Quinlan Voss. Quinlan Voss, teenager. He was a little kid when this came out, so he didn't read it as it came out. He didn't pick up the trades. He's reading it more now, you know. He read something like this later where it's all collected, and this is just a weird way to end the series. Or like Magneto Alex is also another example of this, or Quality Autism. All these guys they're younger than me. This series was done by the time they touched it. They never got the, oh, Demon is the end of this, like I did, where like I read Demon while I was still a teenager, and then War came out and I was 18. Like, and this was grow up, we're done with KOTOR now. And I remember being so bummed that this was the end, that it really tarnished this comic for a long time. And it's not, this comic on its own is fine. The art's fine, the storytelling is fine. It's just a bad way to end KOTOR, and that ultimately that's why it gets a 3.8. And they never continued it after, for better or for worse. And so there's always going to be a part of me that wishes there was a Knights of the Old Republic Volume 11, but that was never to be. And a cynical part of me is thankful for that. And that's where I'll leave this. So anyway, have a good one. Thank you for, putting up with this whole focusing only on this. I really appreciate it.